Hello, I'm Bill Tilton, the local chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Has asked me to make some remarks about an organization that I've been involved with for over 20 years now, called the TLC Brotherhood. This is a group of veterans. TLC stands for Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. So the Thailand, Laos, Cambodia Brotherhood is a group of veterans of the Vietnam War who served outside of Vietnam. TLC service, and when I say TLC, I'm always referring to Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. Over 500,000 veterans served in those countries during that 9-year war. Most of the air attacks were launched from Thailand, and all branches of the services and many others served in those countries. The Air Force, U.S. Army, the Navy, the Coast Guard, Marine Corps, United States Agency for International Development, the Central Intelligence Agency, and others. I'd like to cover today 3 things. I'll give you a context of the war and the geography of it, and I will explain the purposes of the Brotherhood, and then I'm going to focus in on one particular purpose, which is our charitable activities. So first of all, the context. Nowadays, this war is 50 years ago. A lot of people that watch this may not have even been born. I need to tell you this: in Asia. It was in what we used to call French Indochina or Southeast Asia. And the countries are located south of China. Vietnam is about 1,000-mile long country. And then Laos is sandwiched in here. And Cambodia is down at the bottom of Laos. And then to the west is Thailand, at that time known as Siam. And west of that is Burma, which belonged to England at that time. And of course, French Indochina belonged to France from the late 1800s up until 1945. Even during World War II, when the Japanese invaded Southeast Asia, Vichy France did cooperate, and so they were allowed to stay there, sort of in charge. Vietnam is a country that hates invasion. They were occupied by the Chinese for 1,000 years, and they still recognize themselves as Vietnamese and not Chinese. Now, Vietnam means South China, and they are believed to have drifted out of China in prehistoric times. Laos is a mountainous country down through here. The French struggled with the Buddhism and Catholicism during the mid-1800s and fought a number of battles trying to protect Catholic missionaries, and eventually took over this area. And after World War II, communist efforts had been going on since the 1930s, when Ho Chi Minh was over in Thailand and had been trained in Russia, Soviet Union, and they had been struggling for some time. And then in 1945, the communists seriously rejected the French coming back in force as the Japanese left. And so the French War began in that time, and then when the French were kicked out in the 1950s, we've been helping them to a limited extent, and that gets a little bit complicated why that was, but for the purpose of this, I'll just say that it became the American War, and that's when we all became aware of it. The American War actually, we had advisors in the early 1960s, and then in 1965 we went in a serious way and left in 1973. There was a treaty in 1973 after which the prisoners of war, there were about almost 600 prisoners of war, were repatriated, and then 2 years later We had stopped fighting, of course, in '73 with the treaty, and 2 years later the North Vietnamese invaded the South and took over the entire country, and now we just call it Vietnam. Right here in the middle says DMZ, that's the demilitarized zone, and this part was protected by the United States. This part, of course, was a communist country, protected by China and the Soviet Union. There were several other wars fought in this area. Most of the ground fighting took place down here in South Vietnam, but there was a secret war going on in Laos. It started, well, there were two secret wars actually in Laos, and I'm going to concentrate on this one down here, but there was a war between the royalist faction and communists and neutrals. And they were all, I believe they were brothers, the king and his two brothers. They might have been cousins, but they were related. And this war was kind of secret because we were helping the royalists. At the same time, the communists needed to supply the Viet Cong forces that were down here in South Vietnam, and we had effectively blocked off their channels of land supply. So to go around that, they had to enter Laos, which was protected by a international treaty in the 1950s, which we were a signatory to. So they had to do it in secret. When we got involved in the ground war, President Johnson chose to keep it a secret, so we went and fought them in secret. We know that they were under the same secrecy as we were because of letters to home and books that have been written since then, that they were just as much pretending they weren't in there as we were. Okay, so there's a big supply route here, and you may have heard of it. It was called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Most of the airstrikes were at air bases in Thailand into the north part of Vietnam, where Hanoi is the capital, and the airstrikes came out of Thailand and went in there. It's only about 500 or 600 miles, and we had air refueling tankers all along the border of Thailand to refuel these fighters. And then the trail section was also under attack by aircraft out of Thailand. I should mention that a lot of the strikes also came from aircraft carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin out here. In fact, I was flying a tanker once and was chased by a MiG that had come out of Hanoi. And I was on station out here in the Gulf, and radar on an aircraft carrier had me head south, and the fighter then turned and went back. So it wasn't as exciting as it sounds, but anyway. My main job, I was over there twice. My part was as a forward air controller stationed here at a base called Nakhon Phanom. Other bases were Udorn, Tak Ly, Karat, and Ubon. And we also had for a time tankers at Bangkok, and then the B-52s and tankers came in a big way at Utapao down here south of Bangkok. And well, my station here was a forward air controller in 1966, and then in 1971 I went back for 4 months and flew a tanker out of Utapao. Okay, that's the context. Now, a lot of people served in Thailand, as I said, over 500,000, and went home to their jobs in the other assignments, not really knowing what they had supported because a lot of it was a secret war. The pilots taking off from Thailand didn't tell the ground crews where they were going. They saw that the planes were loaded up with bombs and they came back with no bombs on them. And that was about the extent of their knowledge. So if they were even on the flight line, they didn't really have an appreciation of what was going on. They knew there was a war over here in Vietnam, but unless they had already served there, they didn't know much about that either usually. So they went home and didn't think much of it. They thought they just had ordinary service. And when they went to places like Veterans of Foreign Wars meeting halls, they were usually shunned if they got into conversation because they weren't in country. It didn't matter if you were a cook or a mail clerk. If you were in Vietnam, you were in country, and that was one of the buddies. If you were out here, you weren't. And not to say that Thailand was totally peaceful. The Thai communists also did attack bases once in a while, but it was very minor compared to what was going on in Vietnam. Now, as the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War approached, the Department of Defense created an outfit called the Commemorative Partners to commemorate the war, and that's still active. And it was formed up, it was formed up of veterans groups and groups that were within the Defense Department, and a consortium of these groups forming the Commemorative Partners, and we thought we should be part of that. General Kicklighter was in charge of it, and he said, not really, because you folks were over in Thailand. So we sent two of our members who had served in high levels in the government to brief General Kicklighter and his staff, and they gave quite a good briefing explaining what these people did. And the one point that they brought up that actually sealed it was that nearly all the prisoners of war, nearly all of those 600, were from bases in Thailand and aircraft carriers. The 600 were repatriated in 1973, 18 days after the peace treaty was signed. They were mostly Air Force and Navy, and of course we weren't all of them, 1,600, as of 2015, 1,600 people unaccounted for. Now, let's talk about the TLC Brotherhood. And it was founded actually by a group of 3 enlisted guys that were retired, and an officer named Jimmy Butler, who had written a book called A Certain Brotherhood. He tried to write about his experiences. He was a forward air controller just like me. In fact, he was at the same base about 2 months later after I left. And he wrote a book about his experiences, and the Department of Defense told him he couldn't publish it because it had too much detail that wasn't yet declassified. So he wrote a novel, and he called it A Certain Brotherhood. This group got together casually. I think they had met on the internet, and they were sharing experiences, and Colonel Butler was giving them his experiences that they had never heard of. They were pretty excited about it. And he told them how important they had been to the war effort. And so they decided to continue to correspond by internet and to try to find other people, which quickly expanded. It was during the next few months after that someone contacted me and asked me if I'd be interested in getting in the internet group, and of course I was thrilled. I hadn't anybody to talk to about this who had any way of understanding what I was talking about. And this was in 1998, so the war was long over by the time this occurred. Yet it seemed like it had just ended the year before or something in our minds. The group decided to have a get-together in Dayton, Ohio, where the Air Force Museum is located. And we did that casually later that year. And then at that meeting, we went out in the memorial garden of the museum and held a vote as whether or not to organize formally. We decided to have an election, and I happened to be fortunate to be elected the first president. And so we decided to have a reunion in Washington, D.C. area, in Tyson's Corner area, actually. So we could go to the Vietnam Memorial, the wall, we call it. And we did that in 1999. And subsequent to that, we decided to incorporate and become a charity. And I'll explain why we wanted to be a charity. So we got into that and got it accomplished. And of course, when you become a charity and incorporate, you have to declare your purpose. And so we told the IRS and the Corporation Commission of Virginia that we had 4 purposes. The first of these is to create an association for Thailand, Laos, Cambodian Brotherhood veterans, The second was to provide assistance, charity, in Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia. The third, to honor the service of Thailand, Laos, Cambodia Americans who were lost, and memorialize them, and then to preserve the history of our service. The one I'd like to get back to is assistance. In about 1969, a young airman who had grown up as kind of a juvenile delinquent just north of Boston and joined the Air Force to keep from being drafted into the Army, was serving at Nakhon Phanom, the same base that I pointed out, and he was a clerk, a message clerk, handling top secret messages, and off duty he'd go and drink a bunch of beer in the NCO club and go downtown. He told me his morals weren't the highest at that time. And one day he had a day off coming, and one of his buddies said, how about going to an orphanage with me? Well, it was hard for him to find things to do, so he said, yeah, I'll go with you. And they went to a place called Tyre that's about 50 miles west of Nakhon Phanom. And there's a Catholic orphanage there. And this the GI that asked him to go was taking something over there to give to them. And this guy's name was John Sweet, by the way, the gentleman I'm telling you about. And he got to know the priest, Father Chi, who had survived a massacre of Catholic priests that happened during the 40s. I think 12 Catholic priests were murdered at that time, and he managed to escape the activity. And he got this orphanage going. But of course they were poor, didn't have much, and so John, in the, I think, early 90s, he and his wife needed to go to China on business, actually, and made a side trip back down there. And Father Kai was still in charge, still needed things, and so they donated. And then when the Brotherhood got started, he said, why don't we donate to this orphanage? Well, that seemed like a good idea, and we passed the hat. And so it became one of our purposes when we formed. But since then, we've had a lot of other charity. Now, I'm talking about this not as a way to ask you for a donation. Let me get that clear. We have actually more money than we can spend. Donations have been good, and the problem is presence. And we're known for that in this work among people who would like to help the problems in Southeast Asia, because we do have people over there, and we have been able to be effective in making sure that the money is donated to us, 100% of it, all our administrative costs are paid out of our dues. 100% of this goes over to Asia. Then, does it go into somebody's pocket? No, we've had trusted members who we all know who over the years have been able to make sure that the spending was good. It started with Tyre, and then a retired Air Force sergeant named John Middlewood heard about it, and he had moved over there. He had a Thai wife, and he was a missionary, non-denominational, I think, and he established a presence in Nakhon Phanom. He was also a teacher, and there's a tremendous urge to learn English in Thailand for obvious reasons, I think. And so he established an English school for young Thais. And he told us that he was trying to help local schools out of his own pocket, and could we help a little bit? Well, of course we said, tell us what you need. And the thing about Nakhon Phanom province is it's in the northeast part of Thailand. It's a part that was once part of Laos. And the people there speak a dialect that's almost Lao. So the Thais look at them as kind of hillbillies, although it's not a hilly country, but they look at them as not as good as real Thais. And so money from the central government to the schools up there was not too much, not too plentiful, especially outside the towns. In the rural areas, the schools had a lot of needs. They're very poor at that time. And we started providing things like roofs and concrete floors. Over the years, John expanded his activities. He had a soup kitchen. He had in his house. He had an English school where students could come and live there and be immersed in English all the time. A number of things like that. But with our work, he was out in the countryside going to these various schools, and from time to time, members would travel to Thailand, and still do, of course, and would be able to see these things that he had accomplished in person. And it's a lot of fun because the schools would always have a big, they'd usually have a pageant and a presentation, and they do Thai dancing and have a big feast. And you, not always food that we're used to, but it's a great experience because they're extremely grateful for what's been done for them. Over the years, John started running out of projects, actually. The schools had come up, the central government was helping more, and the work that we had done, we were getting down to giving sports equipment and backpacks and sleeping pillows for the kindergarten and things like that. Meanwhile, the VFW, the Veterans Foreign Wars, actually has a chapter in Udorn, Thailand, which is just south of the capital of Laos, west of Nakhon Phanom. And there are a lot of Americans who live there, expatriates who live in that area. And that chapter said that they had some projects, which kind of competed with Nakhon Phanom for a while. There was a gentleman there named Tommy Thompson who was very active in the same way that John Middlewood was, but he suffered a crippling stroke and died within 6 months after that. His helper was a Thai named Vichit, who tried to carry on, but Vichit had an alcohol problem and was unable really to continue our work. And the local VFW chapter, we didn't trust, frankly. So that work rose and fell. For a while we had a member there who was making wheelchairs and canes or crutches out of plastic pipe. And so we funded that for a while, quite successfully. So we did help adults as well as children. And then Middlewood started a program of tuition. He selected students who were very worthy but did not have the capability of paying for the levels of schooling above where the Thai government would provide it for free, which is lower than our 12th grade. I think it's about 8th grade that they stop. So he selected worthy students and had a very strict rule about the grades that they had to maintain. And so we started a student assistance program, which has been quite successful. Unfortunately, Mr. Middlewood died a few years ago, and we didn't have anyone there with his kind of ability to follow these students, so we decided to let that program expire when the last student graduated. We now have, I think, about 6 college level students. We've had some really good successes. Students graduated and went on to great professions. They write us notes, and it tells us that our English teaching hasn't been totally successful, but they do make a good shot at it. So even after he's died, that program is the last remnant actually in Nakhon Phanom. Udorn stopped. Now, meanwhile, one of our members joined. When he applied, he said, I wasn't in the service, my father was. And he wanted to find out about his father, so he joined up. Young man from California. And he wanted to go back and visit the village where his father's aircraft had been shot down. His father was on a rescue mission. I believe it was 67. And he was flying an A-1 Skyreader, a propeller-driven fighter, to protect the helicopters when they went in to extract a shot-down fighter pilot. And he was hit, and he crashed into there's a kind of limestone in this area called karst. It's very vertical. You see it in Chinese paintings a lot in South China. Well, that geology continues on down into Laos. And he hit the base of one of these steep karst mountains. And the young man wanted to go back there and find this. So he did go he had a tourist agency in Nakhon Phanom that had started taking tourists into Laos. Laos had started to open up. Of course, it's still a communist country, pretty much on the model of China. Excuse me. And he did get a trip into the area where his father was shot down. Those of you who are students of that war, it's just south of what we call Mugia Pass or Mujia Pass, which was a main supply route from North Vietnam into Laos on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So that's where the aircraft was. The little village, actually you can't get there by road. You go to a neighboring village and get on a cart. I've been there since then. And you ride a little cart that used to be pulled by oxen, water buffalo, actually. And nowadays they have what they call iron buffaloes, which are like a big garden tractor. And they tow you down there to this village. Well, he went there. And of course he was there under the auspices, the tourist agency had taken him under the auspices of the Lao government, so they knew he was there, the village leader knew he was coming, everything was great. And he stayed there with them for a few days, ate their food, they took him out to the crash site. He found lots of live 20mm ammunition on the ground around the crash site, and actually he collected some of it, and on his way back, crossing the Mekong River, he threw it into the river, so it's still live down there in the bottom of the river someplace. We told him he really shouldn't have done that. Well, he recognized that they had terrific needs here in Ban Nahom, that village. And so he told us about it. We provided some funds. He went back, he documented everything, receipts for what he bought for them. And mainly he got them sports equipment, tablets, writing materials. Typically in Laos, a lot of villages would use the dirt on the floor as a blackboard. So if you give them things like that, it seems pretty fundamental to us, but to them it's a big deal. And he did that. He went back several times, and then he started really getting interested in this. And now he's got his own company or group. He is a recovering drug addict, and he knows that's a huge problem in Laos, so he's been doing a lot of work in that area. We don't fund that. That's his side work. But every year or two, he'll make a trip into several villages in this area, and we do provide funds for that. And again, he documents everything with photographs and receipts. About the time that Udorn stopped being a good place for us to work in, one of our oldest members who lived in Bangkok, Mac Thompson, well known in Southeast Asia, wanted to go back to Laos. He had served in Laos in the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and during the war and before the war, and he knew people all over Laos. He had learned to speak the language, and of course after the capitulation in 1975, he had to leave, and from that time he joined the International Voluntary Service, IVS, and worked in the refugee camps along the border of Thailand and Laos, and Vietnam, where refugees from Vietnam were coming out into Thailand. And the Thais didn't want them there. They didn't really want much to do with them, and the conditions were very poor. And we helped a lot, and he was an agent of the U.S. government helping there. And finally retired and settled down in Bangkok. But he really dearly wanted to go back into Laos, and he finally got permission. And he went to a place called Long Chang, which was about as top secret as a place could be during the secret war, because the CIA was running air support missions out of Long Chang, and the royal government headquarters was there for fighting the war up in Laos. Very few outsiders had been back to Long Chang at all since the war, but he finally got permission to go there, and he told us that he visited the school there, and they didn't even have a bathroom. They had a woods, and the kids were back in the woods. And he said he would like to try a project there, but obviously he couldn't stay there and watch it, and we would be willing to risk some money. I don't remember how much it was. It was somewhere between $2,500 and $5,000. And so we talked it over. We have a committee, and they decided to, I think they even consulted the board of directors, and they agreed we would risk the money. And he took it over there and handed the money to them with a signed agreement. There was one particular teacher that he worked with, and then he arranged to go back. Well, when he went back, I went with him, and so did the young man from Boston that I told you about, John Sweet. He and I and his wife, my wife at that time had passed away, but we went to Long Chang, and as we approached, it was a military compound, sort of, just a little engineering outfit, but it was gated. And as we approached the gate, he said, "Uh-oh, there's an officer guarding the gate," which is pretty unusual. Usually it'd be a low-grade airman or a enlisted man. But that told him something. He said, "No pictures." Well, we'd already taken the pictures from the back seat of the vehicle we were in. And they chatted a little bit, and he said the teacher is coming down the hill shortly to escort us back up to the base, where the old air base had been, and then to the school. And he at that time turned around and looked at John and me, and he said, "You know what, I was president still. That was after my 3 terms. He turned around to us and said, "You know, if this turns out that they squandered the money, I'm going to pay for it." We said, "Okay, we'll see." Well, here came a brand new Chinese motorbike carrying a teacher down the hill. We said, "Uh-oh." Well, the teacher led us back up, and he told Mac before we went up the hill that it wasn't quite finished. The toilet wasn't quite finished. I said, "Yeah, right." Well, we went there, and here was this beautiful concrete 4-door building with a concrete platform and stucco walls and a tile roof, and it was a toilet, 4 toilets. We said, and it even had doors. We said, "What's not finished?" They said, "Well, the septic tank's back here. We haven't connected the pipes up yet and covered it." I said, "Okay, well, you'll get to that." So that was a big relief, and that was the start of what is our current focus, which is Laos. My wife now went with me on a subsequent trip. I guess I've been 3 times. We went way up into Laos because Mac expanded up into villages that were quite far, up to a region, a town called Ban Ban, which was a feared headquarters, the communist headquarters at one time, and the war was being fought. The schools up there are mostly Hmong. They belong to the Hmong people. Again, like Northeast Thailand, the central government considers them mountain. These are really mountain people, and they're tribal mountain people that they don't really, the cosmopolitan people down in the lowlands don't think much of them. And also, there's been some political trouble because the Hmong were the main part of the Royalist Army during the actual war and never really wanted to be communists and used to attack tourist buses and things just to embarrass the central government. I think that's pretty much stopped. But many Hmong have been free. In fact, our first reunion that I mentioned we had in Tyson's Corner area, Mac was there, and we went to a Chinese or a Thai restaurant. It was about a half mile down the hill from where our hotel was, and of course it was a pretty big group of us. We ate everything they had. It didn't matter what you ordered; they brought you what they had, and it was a lot of fun. But it was pretty tough for the restaurant owner, and he came out to talk to some people, and he saw Mac. And my goodness, what a reunion. Mac had relocated him from one of those refugee camps back to Virginia, and it was pretty good. Anyway, Mac's activities have done a great deal, especially in building infrastructure. One thing, or maybe most ambitious things, are dormitories that we've built for students who live too far away from the school to commute or walk to school, and so they can go there and stay during the school term. We've built water purification plants, a lot of kitchens. When we have this, maybe in person I can bring some photographs. We have a picture of a kitchen that the students cook their food in, and it's really basically like a carport. It's got a roof and some poles and a dirt floor and some tables where they put their woks. Well, the woks are on the ground, but that's the kitchen. And I guess they go down to the stream to wash the dishes, but yeah, it was pretty primitive. And we provided a lot of bathrooms, sanitary bathrooms. The metal roofs in that climate last about 6 years, so we've replaced a lot of corrugated steel roofs. When we provide, for instance, a concrete floor, they provide the labor, we provide the materials, and we take pictures before and after and during. So we see where it's going, we get all the receipts back, we know how much it cost, and that the money went where we designated it. So Mac carried this business on for many years, and then about 3 years ago, I guess, he he developed cancer, a very aggressive form of cancer, and never got back. He was on the way back from his last trip, and he collapsed and lived about 6 months longer. So we were left without the greatest presence that we'd ever had since the founding of the Brotherhood. However, Mac was a person with many friends all over the world, and about 6 of them who live in Thailand said that they would like to carry on his work, and they're doing quite a good job of it. They saw how he did it, how he documented it. I don't think they keep the mileage logs the way he did. He knew what elevation he was all the time, things like that. But they have carried it on quite well. So our charity is ongoing. Where do we go from here? Well, we're getting older. The Brotherhood is, we've tried to think of ways to extend the life of the Brotherhood, but I think it will fade out with its members. So, so I've covered what TLC means. I've covered the geography of where Southeast Asia is. I didn't mention why it's so important. It's always been a very important area because of rice production and more during the industrial age, rubber. Vietnam is full of rubber plantations. Thailand and Cambodia, heavy rice producers. They used to be the rice basket for all of Asia. And then we've covered the purposes of the Brotherhood, and finally the charitable purpose. So, thank you for paying attention. Now, another item that we use for fundraising at the reunions is not an auction, but a raffle. Not too many years after we got started, the wife of one of our members offered to donate a quilt. She's a quilter in Indiana, and let that be raffled off. So every year after that, until she died 2 years ago, we've raffled off a quilt. And we've raised over $3,000. I think this year it was a little over 2,000 because it's a little more difficult this year. We didn't have the reunion. We couldn't have it because of COVID. But we did do it by mail, and that activity is very good. So anyway, I would like to thank you very much for listening to my little rundown of the Thailand, Laos, Cambodian Brotherhood.